Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, January 31st, 2025, and our friend Mark Sleboda is back with us. Welcome back, Mark.
Nima, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Dialogue Works.
Let's get started, Mark, with the new administration in Washington, Donald Trump.
The new
Before,
old administration.
yeah,
We've already
yeah,
seen him once before.
yeah. And before 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump was all talking about, I'm going to put an end to the conflict in 24 hours. And in the aftermath of his
Oh,
inauguration,
oh, oh, God. I'm sorry. I just rolled my eyes so hard it actually punctured an eyeball, I think.
he's changing his rhetoric. He's trying to diminish the power of Russia and the reality of the battlefield in Ukraine, exaggerating the casualties on the part of Russians, diminishing or underestimating the casualties on the part of Ukrainians, trying to manipulate, I don't know, talking with Saudi Arabia to reduce the price of oil, talking with Xi in order to convince Xi to put pressure on Russia. He's trying to do each and everything, the sort of things that we usually expect from Donald Trump and his way of thinking or acting. How do you feel about the situation in Ukraine? Does this administration really want to solve the problem, the conflict in Ukraine?
Okay, so first of all, I want to start out by saying that I think there's probably a few too many people in the alt media space whom bought into a little bit of rhetoric for Trump about ending the war in Ukraine and perhaps projected their own beliefs about that onto Donald Trump. And I think that has been a mistake. And I think that some people are slowly starting to realize that. Um, there Donald Trump still, he won the election. He became the US president, which means he owns this war, this conflict. And however much he might like to present it otherwise, right? That it's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and I will come along with a deal that no one will be able to refuse. No, the US is a party to this conflict. What's more, they're a party to the losing side in this conflict. And he has bought into that as the US president now. He doesn't have a choice there. So he doesn't get to dictate terms, right? I think he's beginning to find out. And I'm a little shocked that some of the people around him, with some of the people who are supposedly moving in circles around him, that this hasn't penetrated to his, internal, external narrative thus far. How bad the situation is for the Kiev regime, and of course for the U.S. as its patron, and how little leverage the U.S. has over the Kremlin in this particular situation because of that battlefield imbalance. Right away, we heard one of the first things. We heard this before he assumed office, right? And before he was inaugurated, and we've heard it since that he will, if Putin doesn't accept his deal, right, that he will sanction Russia. Russia's already endured 24,000 sanctions. What's a few more, right? The Russian economy is growing. What's more, the growth rate of the Russian economy has been higher than the United States for the last couple of years, right? He has not that we know of, and I don't believe he has, because the Russians are saying the same thing, that they haven't heard anything from him. He's now been in office for more than 2 weeks, and there's been no phone call. There's been no definitive contact between any top Trump administration officials and the Putin administration in Russia. There's been no direct communication between them, except for this type of social media megaphone diplomacy. Trump put out a social media post on Truth Social that was obviously, I mean, at one hand, yes, it was directed in general about the conflict, but it was obviously intended as a direct statement going, over people's heads, the heads of the media and each other's, by this type of social media post. It was, you could say that it was directed in many ways at Putin. And it was a threat, an ultimatum, and parts of it were in childish, all screaming capital letters. I gotta say, first of all, if I see something in my comments that it's all screaming capital letters, I'm either gonna block it or ignore it, right? I mean, that's just, I'm just saying, right? Those are crazy people who respond to, or childish people, whatever. And I think that's pretty universal, or it should be. He referred to the war as ridiculous, and he referred to that Russia's economy was failing. What? I mean, I know that there's still parts of the Western mainstream media that, even as they put out another article about how sanctions are having no effect, but they still kind of, even when they admit reality, it doesn't penetrate the narrative. Like, it's a blip of fact, but still it snaps back like a rubber band to the Russian economy is failing, because it must be failing, right? Right? Never mind that Russia's GDP growth rate. Never mind that in the past 3 years of enduring tens of thousands of Western sanctions, that Russia's economy, in terms of GDP per purchasing power parity, the only real way to compare economies, right? According to international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, has jumped both Germany and Japan to become the fourth largest economy in the world, behind China, the United States, India, and Russia. And notice that all of those three countries in front of Russia have much larger populations than Russia, right? 100 and maybe 150 million now with some of the new population, compared to over 300 million for the US and around the billion plus for India and China. And Russia is number 4. They jumped Germany and Japan despite this existential economic war of sanctions. And also, it's been admitted again by, the world's financial the world's economic institutions of record, right? That Russia has become a high income country, right? Referring to the lifestyle of the Russian people as a whole, right? Because their salaries are high enough and their purchasing power is high enough that for the first time, this has happened, right? You could say that Russia was close, in some building over the last 30 years, well, 2.5 decades of Putin's government, a recovery from the economic catastrophe of the 90s over time to where they are now. But this is the first time that Russia is considered a high income, first world, fully, country, right? The Russian people are living well, despite this existential economic war of sanctions that was meant to rubble the ruble and immiserate the Russian people so that they overthrew Putin. None of that has happened. Russia's economy it's not that there's, no problems whatsoever. But even if you compare Russia's economic problems, which is moderately high inflation, right? According to government figures, 9 or 10%, and the central bank is doing what they can, raising interest rates to tamp that down. They're actually trying to slow growth. They're worried about overheating of the Russian economy, right? Even though most of that it's not a war economy, because that's not what Russia has at all. It's not like that here. It's a normal, right? The amount that the Russian government is spending on defense, right, on the conflict is still only 6 to 8% of GDP, right? It's not like a World War II, 30-40% of GDP going to that. Russians, they're living essentially like Americans did during the Iraq War, which means to say it doesn't affect their economic lives that much at all, right? Except that the average salaries in Russia have increased significantly over the last few years, which incidentally also has contributed to that moderately high inflation rate. But again, take it in comparison to the inflation in Europe or the inflation in the United States, which was a big campaign issue. And there's still these fantasists in the pro-Kiev regime commentariat in the Western media and analysis who like to believe that somehow this is the sign that the Russian economy is about to collapse. Like this one moderately, less than ideal number. It's absurd. And this will be left in the dust of the thousands of other media reports over the last 3 years, over the last 10 years, over the last 2.5 decades that the Russian economy is about to collapse, right? Because that's what they always fall back on. And it's never been true. I mean, maybe sometime in the future they'll get it right, but it's like all their predictions that Putin is about to die of cancer or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease or any of the other exotic diseases that we've heard in the Western propaganda. And I say propaganda, it's propaganda, right? Let's not call what the West has done in the last 3 years media. It's not. They call us propaganda, but oh my God, they are the real propaganda. And sometime at the end of this conflict, if there's any justice, there will be a comparison between the reality of, say, what many of your guests have been saying for the last 3 years compared to, let's say, the guests on CNN or BBC. And let's do a point-by-point comparison about who was right over the facts on the course of this conflict for the last 3 years. It won't even be a question. It would be too embarrassing. But that, of course, unfortunately, is never going to happen. So he is either being fed bad advice, that is possibly a result of the US's own propaganda. There is a vicious negative feedback circle, right? Where we found out in recent days with the Trump administration putting a 90-day suspension on all foreign aid from the State Department around the world, right? Not just in Ukraine, but that's having an effect there, not on the military side of it as far as we can definitively tell, because that's not coming from the State Department. That's coming from the Defense Department. But the State Department, with the 90%, with the work stop orders and the 90-day suspension for audit and review, we found out that 90% of the Ukrainian media is funded by the United States, according to Ukrainian sources. And now they're begging the Europeans, they're begging people online, oh, pay us, the propaganda must flow, right? So that's feedback loop. The Americans pay for Ukrainian propaganda. The Ukrainian propaganda is published. The Western media receiving no definitive other information, reports what the Ukrainian propaganda says. The Western media says it. Western politicians read it and believe it. And then they act on that policy. They set policy based on this, not just misinformation, but oftentimes active disinformation. And that's why their policy making on Russia, but also you can extend this to China and India and everything, is so bad. They operate, the media space is such bad propaganda. It's a bubble universe. And it's why the US continues to make such bad policy decisions, like believing that their war of sanctions would, have no effect on their own economies and crush Russia, and that feeds into their contemptuous assessment of the Russian military, which has proved equally erroneous. And there have actually appeared two pieces in the past week, not in the mainstream media, one of them in the Quincy Institute and another one on Substack, but excellent research pieces pointing out that the Russian military, at least when we're talking the army, and those would be engaged in a land conflict with the air defense and the air force involved in that, not power projection far from Russia's shores, but let's say a conflict on Russia's border like in Ukraine, that Russia is stronger than the United States and NATO right now, that their military is more powerful. They have a better military industrial base. They have the experience of 3 years of conflict with a near peer adversary that the US just simply lacks, because they've been picking on third world countries and counterinsurgency warfare for the last 3 decades. This is just this really bad policy information fed by propaganda, and you can see it in Trump's statements, right? Again, this referring to 1 million Russian dead. This is absurd, right? It really is absurd. And I will tell you how Western source, you don't have to believe me on that, right? That you can't hide that many dead, right? My gut check on the idea on what Russian casualties are close is actually a BBC funded project by a info warfare outlet set up originally in Russia. Now it's outside Russia officially, called Media Zona. But this is a bunch of Russian liberals who have long worked for the US government, in the Western media, within the same framework of these 90s. This one actually, Western media, because they're affiliated with BBC. But these people have been keeping track of actual Russian dead, right? KIA, since this conflict has begun, that you can assign a name to, right? And they scour Russia. They know how to look in every nook and cranny and find the real name of every dead Russian soldier, right? They scour the obituaries. They harass people's families. They show up at cemeteries. They get leaked information on all types of official data. There's reason to believe that their methodology is reasonably correct. And they've been very active with it. And according to their numbers, the total Russian KIA since the course of this conflict is just probably now a little over 100,000 in 3 years of war, which is far too many, right? 100,000 dead, right? But when you compare it to the course of this conflict, how intense, how it has become a full-on NATO, the West against Russia proxy war, and when you compare it to the Ukrainians, and here the Russian government numbers actually of the Ukrainian dead is actually less than the propaganda on the other side. The Russian Ministry of Defense now reports 1.1 million what they call irretrievable losses. that includes both KIA, and it includes those who are wounded enough that they cannot be effectively be returned to the battlefield in any reasonable length of time, right? And they come up with 1.1 million. But so when you realize that over 100,000, 110, 120, whatever on the Russian side is far too many, compare that to 1.1 million total on the other side, and you're still coming up with a Russian Kiev regime casualty rate that is probably 4 to 5 to 6 to 1, right, over the course of this conflict. And if Trump is approaching, his idea of how he can cut a deal or force a deal and end this conflict, as he has promised to do, is based on all of this not just erroneous, but active disinformation about the state of Russia and the real state of this conflict, of course he's going to go into this from an absolutely fantastical position that has nothing to do with reality, and the Russians are just gonna whatever. I mean, we'll talk, but no deal. We've already presented our terms. We're winning. You accept our terms, not the other way around. You are operating from a fantasy universe. So there's a question. Is he playing along with the propaganda, or is he still this disinformed? And the idea that he can, issue it, this war must stop in screaming capital letters, and I will be doing Russia a favor. Those are threats. Those are ultimatums. Those are social media screaming imperatives, ordering the Russian president what to do. Could you say that for the first communication, from Trump himself directed at Putin, at the Russian government, that this was just the really wrong way to go? And lately, Trump has been embracing this characterization primarily over his bullying of Colombia on the issue of migrants. They're calling it the FAFO foreign policy. And I actually had to look this up because I'm not up with the slang and I didn't know what that means. And it means F around and find out, right? It's like gangster slang, right? You F with me, and me and my friend, we go pay a visit to your family and break some knees, right? That sort of thing. And Trump even reposted a mock-up of him in a gangster three-piece suit with the FAFO foreign policy on the wall in the background, right? Like he is embracing this image. Well, I've got news for you, Don. Russia is not Colombia. You're dealing with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, probably one of, if not the most capable statesmen, in the world today, and operating from a position of strength in this conflict and beyond, who has weathered everything that the U.S. has thrown at them and only gotten stronger militarily and economically, particularly in the sense that they are now largely sanction proof, right? The U.S. can't enforce their will on Russia with economic threats anymore because Russia has weathered 24,000 sanctions and, just carried on. And the Russian economy is growing. So if this is the way he's approaching these negotiations with threats, with ultimatums, with childish social media posts, he thought he was going to rope OPEC in, Saudi Arabia into crashing the oil price, immiserating their own economy, because that would end the war. And Saudi Arabia is not only like no, but F no, I mean, like that was the response from OPEC. Like Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is also known as OPEC plus, right? Because Saudi Arabia and Russia are the two biggest oil exporters in the world, right? And they have found that it actually makes a lot of sense for them to work together to manage oil prices, a lot more than Saudi Arabia has with OPEC, because OPEC is a gaggle of countries, a lot of them Arab countries, of course, not only, but that it is just much harder for Saudi Arabia to herd, to get them to do what it wants to do. Whereas if it goes with Russia and they simply come to an agreement, then everyone else has to buy in, because those are the two biggest chunks of the market there. And this has worked very well for Saudi Arabia and Russia. They both, neither one of them wants the oil price too high as to stress their own and global economies. Remember, Russia, whatever the West may believe, is a major manufacturing country as well, as evidenced by the fact that we had the NATO Secretary General this week admit again that Russia is outproducing all of NATO by put together, including the United States, by more than 3 times, in at least in terms of the type of munitions and military equipment that is needed for this conflict. So he's operating from a fictional military reality, a fictional political reality, a fictional economic reality. Where does that leave him with this type of bluff and bluster? Yeah, and we've seen him walk back to 24 hours. Now it's 100 days or 6 months and so forth. But they've gotten really quiet in the last week or so. We haven't heard anything. There's been no telephone conversation yet. No idea that Kellogg even will be visiting Russia anytime soon. And Russia just keeps steamrolling on the battlefield, right? They keep making the reality on the battlefield a little worse for the U.S. and the Kiev regime every day, right? We don't see dramatic, huge, maneuver warfare sweeping yet, right? But the war of attrition is definitely telling, and the Western mainstream media is full of it. So I don't know where that leaves the Trump administration, because ultimately, can Trump afford to be painted as the man who just handed Ukraine to Putin on a silver platter? No, right? He'll be called a traitor. He'll be called weak. All of this other things, all of this. Oh, China and Iran and everyone else under the sun will take inspiration from this. They'll show how weak the U.S. is, and they'll take advantage. And you need to escalate if you want to de-escalate. All of this is going to be, and at least in economic terms, that's what we've already seen Trump trying to resort to: threats of sanctions, threats of tariffs. Like Russia and the U.S. hardly do any business, except for things like uranium, which the U.S. is buying like hotcakes still, because they need it and they can't really get it from anywhere else, not in the quantity that they need. So the idea that I know Trump loves tariffs, but tariffs aren't going to work about Russia. There's far too little exposure between their economies, and the sanctions haven't worked. So that really leaves him without any real leverage. And the idea that they could arm Ukraine, we know that's nonsense, because we know, again, from Western mainstream media reports and Pentagon statements and everything else, that the NATO, including the U.S., are about tapped out. Their stockpiles are empty. They're now providing artillery shells and other, air defense interceptor missiles to the Kiev regime simply on a monthly production basis, because they've got no more stocks left, which means only the small amount that they produce monthly, and it is very small, right? In relative terms, not enough, and not anywhere near enough to meet the Kiev regime's needs, not anywhere even in the same league as what Russia is producing in terms of artillery shells, in terms of air defense interceptor missiles. So if Trump had, if there was still anything left in the U.S. quiver and inventory that they could provide to the Kiev regime, that the Kiev regime could effectively use, Biden would have given it. right? He was, giving everything, throwing the kitchen sink out the door in the final days of his administration in the direction of Ukraine. So the idea that he's going to escalate is also equally, unless, he will go the exact opposite route of what he proclaimed and actually put US troops on the ground, which also seems extremely unlikely and would still be vastly outnumbered by the Russian military at this point. So no leverage. The US is in a really bad position. And Russia, with everything that's coming out of Europe and the Trump administration and the Kiev regime, the attitude in the Kremlin is hardening and hardening and hardening. And we had a piece of information come out of Ukraine, come out of the Kiev regime this week that, kind of ties all of this together of where we are. Now, this is a report that came out of the Ukrainian media outlet Strana. And Strana is an interesting publication, right? It is a Ukrainian and it is a pro-Ukrainian position, but one that has been willing to be critical of the Kiev regime and of the Ukrainian military in their carrying out of the war, and even occasionally of the West, in a way that means that they had to move outside of the country for their operation, at least for their publishing, because Zelensky has this dictatorial unified information policy where you're simply not allowed to criticize the government. I mean, the entire media sphere of Ukraine is George Orwell, right? I mean, that's this is what he was warning about. So Strana came out with a piece though that they have it from people who were in a closed session of the Rada, of their top military and foreign policy committees, receiving a number of briefings from top Ukrainian military and intelligence. And one of the speakers at this was according to this report, was the Kiev regime's military intelligence chief, this psychotic genocidal maniac, Kyrylo I like the dark Budanov, the one who usually refuses to have an interview in a lighted room because, I don't know, he's a vampire or whatever, I don't know. At least that's what he said in interviews with the Western media that he's done before. But evidently he was asked, how long do we have? And reportedly he said that if we do not begin serious peace negotiations, then by the end of the summer, then by the midsummer, actually, I think he said, within 6 months, essentially, then processes will have begun that will question the existence of Ukraine, right? Which we've also heard from the Russian intelligence figures, that they say that at this point, Russian intelligence chiefs have said that that by the end of 2025, which I think is a little optimistic, I don't actually agree with that time frame, but that Ukraine may cease to exist as a state. Now, there was an attempt to walk this back that basically boiled down to saying that Budanov's comments were taken out of context. And by the way, whoever leaked that is going to be shot, right? I mean, that's essentially what it boiled down to. But I think from the reaction that we've gotten from the Kiev regime by this weird kind of allegory / joke that Budanov then responded to a Ukrainian journalist about this, we can assume that this is what he said. I mean, I think that all of this adds up to being this being a, shall we say, largely true story, and it fits with a lot of what we're having. Again, he didn't say that the Ukrainian military is going to completely collapse by midsummer, which is the way a lot of people are reading that. That is not what the man said. The man said that if negotiations are not begin by midsummer, then processes will begin that will question the existence of Ukraine, i.e., at some point in the future. So a lot of people are trying to, again, read too much into that, I think, especially in terms of time frame and this belief that the Ukrainian military is just going to collapse tomorrow or 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now, and that'll be it. That's not what he said. But it does certainly point to the way things are going on the battlefield. And it does not bode well for Trump's position in, cutting a deal and, as he declared, end this conflict. Right now, neither the Kiev regime nor Russia are interested in ending this conflict. Not where it is right now. Russia hasn't gotten the Kiev regime and the West to admit that they've lost and accept terms yet, and they don't accept the reality the way it is now. So I think that Trump wants Ukraine gone, right? He's not interested in Ukraine. He probably hates Zelensky and his administration. He hates the whole Kiev regime. He sees them as interconnected and intrinsically involved in attempts to impeach him during his first administration with the Steele dossier and all of this other nonsense and leaks, and that the Kiev regime was, as far as the Republicans were concerned, openly campaigning for Biden and Harris during this last election. Trump doesn't like Europe, right? He doesn't like, certainly Western European leaders, Orban, being the exception there. And the fact that they're so concerned about this, he views this as Europe's problem. He would rather focus on confronting China or genociding the Palestinians out of the Middle East, right? Or at least giving Israel the cover to do so, which he has now openly, done what every U.S. president and Israeli president has slowly, effectively been doing for decades. He just said the quiet part out loud that no one else has said. He would rather focus on China and his war against the deep state in the U.S. and Israel, and not on Ukraine. But he can't just wish it away, and I don't believe he can just walk away either, because he's the U.S. president. But that leaves him in an extremely weak position, where right now it appears the Trump administration is trying to, one, consolidate itself and get as many as its people through confirmation hearings, right? So they've got their Secretary of Defense through, they've got their Secretary of State, they've got the Secretary of the Treasury, and numerous others. Some of the other ones probably aren't going to happen. Tulsi Gabbard, Robert Kennedy. I mean, we know that that's probably not going to happen, but they're also less important. But now the Trump's officials will attempt to gain control of their respective departments and institutions in the U.S. And maybe then they'll be ready to seriously start planning what to do with Russia and Ukraine. But it seems like they've effectively, not being able to solve it in 24 hours, put it on the back burner now. Maybe they wish it would just go away, but it's not. So I do not have any hopes for Trump ending this conflict. None, right? It's not going to end on Trump's terms. And he has even admitted that, right? He has even said that this is up to Putin to end this conflict. And he's right? I mean, it's not just Putin. There's always this attempt to caricature an entire state down to one person and everything. But this conflict will end on Russia's terms, or it won't end until those terms are decided on the battlefield, if they can't be reached diplomatically. And I think ultimately that's still where we're going to end up, which means that the conflict will go on for a while. The only question then becomes, how much does Trump have the United States still involved in providing armaments to the Kiev regime? And that is an open question at this point.
On January 16, there was an article in the Time, and I don't the exact word of that title, but it said that Ukraine is losing, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is losing in Ukraine. Do you think that the Biden administration and the way they were connecting to the people, Mike Waltz and Jake Sullivan was talking with Mike Waltz and other people in the Trump administration to transfer the information on their part to the new administration? Do you think that the Trump administration was convinced by these people that, after all, doesn't matter what's going to happen to Ukraine, the United States is not going to lose in Ukraine, and the outcome would be for the benefit of the United States?
Okay, so I think actually what you're referring to is an article in Time magazine.
Yeah,
Another article by Simon Schuster, why Biden's Ukraine win was Zelensky's loss.
That's right.
Yeah. This is spin. This is 100% spin, trying to whitewash a Biden legacy, right? Obviously directly fed by Biden administration officials, right? But, like I'm sure Blinken, and others, but also completely embraced, in that propaganda role by Simon Schuster himself. And okay, we know this story is false, right? The US believed that they were going to destroy Russia, right? Not necessarily on the battlefield, although they had, it's quite obvious from statements we've had from Mark Milley and others that they had a completely fictional, contemptuous view of the Russian military that was very, very far from reality, that they were moralists and ill-trained and fighting with shovels and all this other nonsense, and that they would throw down their shovels and run away as soon as Western Abrams and Challengers appeared on the horizon. And evidently they seriously believe this. So, but I think they actually counted that it was the economic sanctions that were going to destroy the Russian economy and then thus destroy the Russian military. And then that political damage would and the economic immiseration of the Russian people would lead to protests and Putin leaving office in disgrace and possibly even the breaking up of Russia, right? That they actually believed in this fictional scenario. And there's enough evidence that the Biden administration itself, right? We had Biden himself saying about Putin, this man cannot remain in office, right? Or this man cannot, remain in power. I don't remember what the exact words were, but I mean, it was said in this moment of outrage and everything. And, for years they were, talking about taking back all of Ukrainian territory and then Russia paying reparations and all of this ridiculous nonsense. The ruble is rubble, and, to now try and do a this type of 180 or a Baerbock 360, I guess, on this story, the way they're presenting it now, and present it as Biden's win. No, this was not the intention of the Biden administration. They thought they were going to deal a crippling blow to Russia geopolitically and then turn and pivot hard to China. That's what they imagined. And to try and present this now as somehow Biden winning, no, that is not. Now, you could make an argument that the U.S. still wins in some respects in this conflict. For one, the U.S. loss of life has obviously been very small. probably within the hundreds when we're talking special forces and they're mercenaries on the ground and so forth. And most of the money spent has been on US arms, which is, as has been pointed out, recycling within the US military industrial complex anyway, which funds half of these politicians, with campaign contributions, right? So, I mean, even if the US people don't have their money spent on anything useful in terms of GDP, total, it's not really harming the US. And you could actually argue that it is benefiting the US in several ways. One, that Europe is so immiserated because of the now high energy prices that they have to pay for not having Russian energy, Germany deindustrializing and so forth, and all of these energy intensive European companies, particularly Germany, actually moving to the United States to set up shop. And the New York Times reported on this over a year ago already. That is a benefit to the United States. It's simply stripping essentially economic assets out of Europe and creating the conditions where they set up in the United States instead. And increased US LNG sales, right? That is a big thing for Trump in particular. But Europe is now far more dependent on far more expensive and far less quantity US LNG, although they're also buying Russian LNG like crazy, simply because it's not sanctioned and being very quiet about it. It's all so ridiculous considering how much more expensive even Russian LNG is compared to Russian piped gas. It's absolutely a fantasy world that they're of information warfare that they're fighting in there. But another way that the U.S. has won is that Europe is less connected with Russia than ever. Right, the political rift, I don't believe it can easily be healed like in generations. We're talking, right? It isn't, the war isn't going to end, and Russian European relations aren't going to return to normal. And most evidently and physically, that was done with the U.S. destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, right? To not give Germany the option of going back, right? That was, quite intentional and deliberate. So you can say that these are victories for the Biden administration, this severing of relations and making Europe at the same time poorer and more dependent on the US economically and military than ever before. But at the same time, this has done immeasurable amount of reputational and credibility damage to the United States. Because however they're trying to spin it now, we said we would help them as long as it takes, but we didn't say as long as it takes to do what. I mean, that's the ridiculous stuff that they're talking now, trying to spin it, right? Like, we held our fingers, crossed behind our back when we were saying it. That's the equivalent of what this ridiculous article is trying to argue. No, the entire world is aware that the US and all of NATO declared that Russia must lose and Russia is winning, right? That is a huge blow to the US geopolitically, as has been said at different times by different people, right? We had Mark Milley, the former US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, say that U.S. global leadership is at risk. We had other figures say that the rules-based order, we make the rules, we give the orders, is at risk. Boris Johnson said it outright. Western hegemony is at risk, right? Because if Russia wins here, right, hegemony is at some level also built and dependent on fear and a belief in the power of the hegemon. And if that is put on the line in such a definitive and loud way as they did, this could have happened differently. If they hadn't been so ridiculously pro-Kiev regime, Russia must Putin must go. Russia must not only lose, they must suffer a strategic defeat. They must be humiliated. They must be a misery. They said all of this, and none of it is going to happen, like they said. So that is definitely not a win, right? It is one of those, how do you measure credibility and reputation when it comes to international relations and geopolitics? It's not something that you can easily quantify, right? But it is real nonetheless, or it has real world effects, is another way of saying it. And in a way, simply by saying that their hegemony is on the line, they've put it on the line, right? So again, while you can talk tactical wins for the U.S., right, particularly via Europe and some other things, the idea that they've weakened Russia is completely false. And again, these two articles out, the Quincy Institute and elsewhere this week, the Russian military is much stronger than it has ever been before, and it's getting stronger, not weaker, not deteriorated, but stronger and more experienced every day this conflict goes on. And they're also getting angrier. They're getting angrier and more embittered, right? So that is not a win for the Biden administration, right? There was this belief voiced by Lindsey Graham and others, oh, we're doing well, we're paying a minuscule price and weakening Russia and the Russian military, right? We even had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs say, or Lloyd Austin say that the goal was to weaken Russia. That has the opposite has happened. Russia is less vulnerable to their economic blackmail, leverage, diktats than ever before. Its military is more powerful than ever before. Politically, at home, the pro-Western liberal opposition that was at 1.5% of the Russian population is gone. They're silent. They're not even in the country anymore. Or if they are, they're completely powerless and shouted down at this point. The path that the Putin administration has set politically and geopolitically for Russia is more embraced, more enthusiastically, with a greater amount of domestic political strength than ever before, right? The U.S. was flirting, with floating Navalny and all of this other nonsense that was nonsense and had, very little impact in Russia. But that's all gone now, as a result of all of this. What little cracks they were trying to force into Russia domestically is gone. That's definitely not another win for the Biden administration. So while you can point to a few small tactical geopolitical things that the U.S. has benefited from, I think overall it's quite clear that the opposite is true, and that this is latter-day whitewashing, trying to shine up the Biden legacy, which should be abysmal, because although I think it is primarily more Erdogan than the Biden administration. Obviously, they had some piece in it. The overthrow of the Syrian government in the last days of the Biden administration, again, even if it was far more Erdogan than anything else, that is still something that gets lost in the greater share. Obviously, Syria is not as important to Russia as Ukraine and the conflict there, but that was a geopolitical loss for Russia. Whether it's a geopolitical gain for the United States, that remains to be seen, right? So certainly it was a win for Turkey in the short term. Once again, I think that Erdogan has bitten off more than Turkey can geopolitically cash those checks. And again, the idea that Israel has benefited from that, I think they've created more a mess for themselves. I think everyone is going to find out that removing Assad and Russia from Syria will, at the end of the day, create far more headaches for them by a destabilized, fractured Syria run by Al Qaeda than it's going to cause more blowback to them than benefit at the end of the day, right? Erdogan's neo-Ottoman pretensions to the side. So again, you could kind of notch that one up in Biden's belt, but no one's really even talking about that because officially the U.S. had absolutely nothing to do with it, and they still, in reality, had probably far less to do with it than Erdogan and Turkish intelligence did. But that's still out there. So, but again, overall, the Biden's foreign policy has been an abysmal failure, and it stopped where it was supposed to be a quick victory and just start. They ran headlong into Russia and just smashed themselves on the ground. This is latter-day whitewashing and propaganda.
At least Erdogan was capable of giving Joe Biden a big and attractive present before leaving Washington, that he says, I defeated Russia and Iran at the same time.
At the same time, Erdogan clearly wanted Russian bases to remain in Syria as a hedge against the U.S., right, and Israel, and that's almost certainly not going to happen. Russia is getting rid of those bases; they are evacuating. But also, now Trump is talking again, which he didn't manage to complete during his first administration, about getting U.S. troops out of Syria. And that is now threatening to just whole-scale dump the Kurds to Al-Qaeda's HTS's tender mercies. Oh, you poor, stupid idiots. You could have gone over to Russia and the Syrian government that would have welcomed you back under good terms, right? Not independence, but good terms. At any time, in the past, 7 years, and now it's too late. Now you're going to be thrown to the Al-Qaeda wolves because this is inevitably, at the end of the day, the doomed fate of any U.S. proxy. They always get thrown to the side eventually, and yet they never learn from past proxies. Never learn.
How do you find the way that Donald Trump is dealing with the situation in Gaza? Before January 20th, he's tried to force Netanyahu into a ceasefire between Gazans or Palestinians and Israelis. And right now he's talking about, and just mentioning that the day after his inauguration, when he was signing his executive orders, he said that this is not our war, this is their war. Then he went after rebuilding Gaza I do assume that for settlers. Right now he's trying to convince, even today, he said that I'm going to pressure Egypt and Jordan to accept Palestinians because he wants to rebuild Gaza, in my opinion, for settlers, for Israelis. But how is that going to work for him? It was the same sort of policy, if you remember, since this conflict started. The Biden administration, Anthony Blinken, did everything to help them, which didn't work. Why does Donald Trump think that he's going to be different from what we've seen so far?
Because he's an incredible egotist and narcissist. That's why he's a megalomaniac, right? Even more than Blinken, right? Okay, so here is another case, I believe, that far too many people in the alt media operated on a very small amount of data points and projected their own desires for the situation in the Middle East onto Trump incorrectly, right? And a lot of people are really, their heads are spinning as a result of this. And Trump is not the messiah of multipolarism that some people evidently, for some reason, thought he would be. We know from Trump has been president before. And at the end of the day, you always go back to that first administration and look what happened and understand that he might have a little more domestic political power and less hanging over his head than before, but that ultimately you shouldn't expect too drastic a change from what came before, right? That should always be your default, right? Maybe some, but you should always go back on that. And we know that during Trump's first administration that he had very good relations with Israel, that he had very good personal relations with Netanyahu, and that was when the U.S. moved its recognition and its embassy of Israel's capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, right? And he was the one working on engineering this normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel as his big signature project that he didn't push over the line, but came really close. Then, with this new Trump administration 2.0 coming in, there was just a couple of things that were seemingly off comments. Trump presenting himself as being some type of peacemaker, which has always been absurd. With the fact that on one of Trump's social media accounts, a video of Jeffrey Sachs being critical of Netanyahu was posted, and they jumped to all kinds of fantastical beliefs about Trump and what he would do in the Middle East, and there just wasn't the evidence there to say that some dramatic shift in Trump's feelings and policy towards Israel and towards the Middle East had changed. And then there was a misreading of, I believe, of this entire ceasefire thing. Now, Trump wanted a ceasefire for his inauguration, right? Because he promised that it would be. He couldn't deliver on Russia and Ukraine, but he wanted to double down and get that perception of Israel and him bringing peace to the Middle East, as absurd as that is, right, on his inauguration day. But Netanyahu suddenly went kind of belly up, like a dog showing its belly, and just accepted a deal that he had previously refused under Biden, right? Which I don't actually believe that Biden and Blinken ever really intended to have fulfilled in the first place, right? This was all distraction to keep, people believing that the U.S. wasn't actively working towards the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, even under the Biden administration, right? But suddenly Netanyahu comes forward and accepts this without any even apparent griping, without a step back, anything that has happened with these previous ceasefire attempts that have happened, right? And he even publicly tried to defend it against some of the, the more hardliners in his own cabinet. Why? Right? So everyone's like, oh, what did Trump do? What did he threaten? What did he, what? It wasn't like that. I said this right away. What people are missing from that equation is there was almost certainly a stick and a carrot, right? Trump promised Netanyahu something in return for something. And I believe that now we're finding out. You give me my media ceasefire win with, a ceasefire, and you get your hostages back, right? You're not doing that well militarily on the ground with Hamas anyway, right? And in return, I will then help you ethnically cleanse Palestine, out of existence, to force all the Palestinians out of the country. Now, this is not a new policy, right? First of all, this has been the policy quietly of the US government and the Israeli government for decades, right? That's what this whole process of settlers, as they call it, right? Western colonizers, Western Jewish colonizing of, a greater Israel, right? Palestine and bits of other surrounding countries. This has been going on for decades, right? But it was happening one settlement, one block, one house being bulldozed and the settlers brought in at a time. Now, under the Biden administration, we saw them clearly embrace doing that on an accelerated schedule. And it wasn't said outright like Trump has, but it was clear. Blinken went to Sisi in Egypt and went to Jordan and said, open the borders, right? And then at some point later, sure, we'll let the Palestinians back in once Hamas is cleared out. But everyone knew, right? Egypt knew, they knew, everyone knew that that was a fiction. And Sisi held and said, no, that's not going to happen. I don't like Hamas. They're just the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. But I can see clearly what you want to do here. I'm not going to be a party to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And I'm certainly not going to take 3 to 4 million more Palestinian refugees and have to support them in my country on top of this, right? He said no. So Trump comes along and promises her. If you notice that while the ceasefire in Gaza has been happening, that the Israeli government has also started moving on the West Bank, right? Jenin and elsewhere. And I believe that that's probably only a precursor. And now Trump comes out and says out loud what the Biden administration and what on a slower time frame previous U.S. administrations have always done. Let's move all the Arabs out of Palestine into the surrounding countries. It's the most humane thing. Of course, it's I love that the Iranian government suggested, well, why don't we move all the Israelis to Greenland? Of course, that would be humane too, right? Of course, that's not the way that's going to work and so forth. But I found that drolly amusing and pointing out, of course, the hypocrisies of the situation. And of course, Trump will never call it that. But did you hear any voices of protests from Europe when he said that, or from even anyone else in the U.S.? Right? I didn't hear any overt criticism of that, because everyone knows that has quietly been the policy on a slower time frame for a long time. Now, Trump is simply counting that he, again, with his belief in his own art of the deal expertise, because his experience as a bully in New York real estate can clearly, completely transfer to international relations and diplomacy, right? And if he can do one, he can do the other. Why not, right? I mean, it's not like it requires any specialist knowledge or skills, right? I mean, that's the idea. The man is a narcissist. He is an egotist. He is a megalomaniac, right? Evidently King Donald the Orange of Greenland and the Panama Canal as well. Maybe Canada too. I don't know. He believes that, and he's said it quite, I will make, right? They will accept this, right? I mean, he obviously has threats and plans, and he has a lot more leverage over Egypt than he does over Russia. Not maybe quite as easy to bully as Colombia, but the Egyptian military is after now Ukraine and Israel, and has long been a huge recipient of U.S. military aid, right? This was the way the U.S. bought off Egypt. You enforce our protection of Israel on this border, and we'll completely fund your military and let you do whatever you want in your country, right? This was long been the political deal between the U.S. and Egypt, right, since the latter days of the Cold War. That continues. And if Trump could just threaten to cut off all military aid to Egypt, and where would that leave them? Right? They've got several regional tense situations with surrounding states. They've got Israel. They've got internal problems because they are still, the Islamists are a very powerful force in Egypt that they overthrew militarily, right? And then papered over with elections. Egypt has got a lot of problems. They've got huge economic problems. They've got huge demographic problems, far too many young people, not enough food, not enough jobs. Very, very, Egypt is not in a good place. And they're incredibly dependent also on Saudi Arabia economically, right? So, who knows what deal. Saudi doesn't seem like it's playing balls with the U.S., with Trump right now, at least on the issue of oil prices. But there is, good reason to believe that Trump he believes he can force Egypt into complying and opening up the border, right? Again, very loudly, there will be a stick, right? There will probably also be a carrot as well, because that will be involved, and he seems to think he can get it. I mean, it is a horrible thing to even contemplate now, but even more than during the Biden administration, the fate of the Palestinian people may be dependent on the Egyptian president, the Egyptian military dictator, Al-Sisi. That's a hell of a burden to bear. Trump thinks that again, his confidence, his ego on his ability to make and to bully and to pressure and to threaten and to wheedle a deal. And again, Colombia, Egypt, Russia, and China. Right? There's a range of how much power the U.S. still has, how much leverage between those three situations and many other situations. We see Denmark curling up and going like this effectively right now as well. So we'll have to see how much this. Trump is obviously running his foreign policy. On one hand, you can say like a mafia don, right? Which I guess Don, pun not intended. That's appropriate. On the other hand, obviously geopolitically, he thinks that hegemony and primacy, the way it's been played, is far too expensive and has far too few benefits to America than the costs involved. But his idea of retrenchment and an alternative is just old school imperialism, where the Western Hemisphere is mine, and I still get to play around in the Middle East and elsewhere as well. So I'm not sure that the abandonment, or at least the switch in foreign policy priorities from Biden to Trump and from everyone else, in previous administrations to Trump, is necessarily a good one, though. It's still United States. People have to get past this, I think, naive belief and hope that if the Americans can just elect Coke instead of Pepsi, that everything's going to be better and the world's problems are going to be solved. It's not, right? It is a managed system. And yes, Trump may be slightly better than Biden in some ways, but he's going to be worse in other ways. He's still the American president. And ultimately, he's a more ignorant and narcissistic one than the previous one was. Yes, he's a little bit unorthodox, and yet, yes, he is a bit of a chaos bomb, and he will doubtlessly ruin even further transatlantic relations, right, between the U.S. and Europe. It seems to be almost a definitive, and that plays to Russia and China's advantage to a certain degree. It does, but with enough other chaos bombs going off here and there and everywhere else with Trump, who knows where the dust is going to settle at the end of the day. He's unpredictable. right? I mean, other than the fact that he responds to flattery, which seems to be one of the one of the truly predictable things about him. But even that, Zelensky has been trying now to, shall we say, lick Donald Trump's posterior to a rather obsequious degree, and that's not working. I don't think that that Zelensky is ultimately very sincere or very good at the flattery game, the way some other leaders like Putin is. You see Putin very subtly in the last week refer to a stolen election in the US in 2020. Now, I'm not going to get involved in debates or conspiracy theories about that, but it's quite obvious Putin has never mentioned that before, right? And it's quite obviously a psychological attempt to shift Trump into a pro-Putin, pro-Russia mindset, right? That's pretty blatant. Putin did that previously by playing to Trump's beliefs about climate change, that it wasn't real. And suddenly, Putin, who had always taken the issue very seriously, as Ross Hydromet and the Russian Academy of Sciences did, suddenly, when I was around Trump, he started making statements that could be interpreted as being similar to things that Trump said, if you wanted to read it the right way. At the end of the day, yes, Putin is previous Soviet Russian intelligence. He's KGB. Yes, he has a psychological profile of Trump, as unpredictable, and a chaos bomb as the man can be. But yes, Putin will certainly try to play Trump, right? As everyone else does. Everyone within his own administration. John Bolton outright admitted it in his memoirs. We manipulated him on a daily basis to do what we neocons wanted to do. We held information from him. We presented him with limited options, right? We did everything we could to manipulate him on North Korea and everything else, right? Is Zelensky complaining that, Putin is trying to manipulate Trump? Yes, as you are doing, as every other leader in the world is trying to do, as everyone within his own administration in the US is trying to do. Everyone is trying to do that. The only thing is that Putin is probably a little bit better at it than Zelensky, right? And some other people. I mean, that's the game. That's part. It's not the game. It's part of the game. No, and Trump, by all appearances, is probably more susceptible to that sort of thing than say some other presidents normally are, because the man is a narcissist and an egotist and a megalomaniac. And that's not me being any more critical of Trump than I am of the senile corpse that was Biden. It's just a realistic assessment of the man, right? I don't prefer Biden to Trump or Kamala Harris to Trump or something like that. This binary, one or the other that American, people seemed locked in. I hate and despise and have contempt for them all on pretty much equal terms, just in different flavors, right? According to their specific characteristics. There's no particular love there. But I'm not gonna suddenly, become a Trump fanboy that I think that far too many people in the alt media have done. I believe, again, projecting somewhat of their own hopes on Trump than was perhaps wise or realistic. And that's the whole problem with having hope to begin with. I just don't do hope. Hope is the carrot dangled in front of the mule to keep it plodding along. Simply remove the carrot and walk forward with your eyes open. Or hope is the denial of reality.
Ever since I lost hope, I feel much better.
No, you don't. You feel terrible. But when you're wrong, there's actually a pleasant surprise. It just doesn't happen that often. That's all. It's it's a depressing way of looking at the world, and obviously not everyone can handle that, and it's not even necessary, right? Journalists are allowed to have hope, right? It's, there's different schools of journalism, but some journalists should even have hope, right? It would be a terrible world, right, if journalists couldn't talk, in terms of hope, right, and everything. But for analysts, it's a different story. And I'm not a journalist, right? At least I don't think of myself like that. I think of myself as an analyst. And hope is the death of analysis, it is the death of objectivity, right? I can still have preferences, but I don't let hope interfere with at least I try not to let hope interfere with my analysis. And I think I've more or less held up to that over the years.
Mark, how did you find the comprehensive deal between Iran and Russia? And from what we've seen so far, at least from the Iranian president, he said that it's a huge framework for Iran and Russia, and it's about security, military, economy. It's all everything in this comprehensive agreement.
Okay, so first of all, I think that everyone is concerned about the strategic and the military parts of this, which are largely kept out of public view, right? We don't know what the terms of Russia providing intelligence and air defense and whatever for Iran are. Everyone assumes, and I do too, that they are probably going to be significant. Although keep in mind, they're not something that can happen overnight, right? Iran needs to avoid being leveled to the ground by Trump in the next 4 years, right? For Russia to start to set up air defense networks, integrated, interconnected air defense in this way. It's something that will take time to grow to fruition. But I think that what a lot of people are not talking about enough when it comes to this is the economic relations, right? In particular, this agreements to grow and to invest in the north-south corridor, in pipelines between Russia and Iran that seem to be dovetailing onto this, about the interconnection of the Russian and Iranian financial systems in terms of a SWIFT analog, the mirror payment system, and elsewhere, of the open visa policies. These other things are, I think, just as, and maybe in the short term, even more important than the military strategic one, because that one's going to take some time to cement, to grow, right, and to become hardened. Israel or Iran will still be very, vulnerable to U.S. and Israeli attacks, right? I'm actually far more worried about, shall we say, internal attacks and Israel's ability to penetrate Iran with its intelligence and assassination and terrorist and traitor networks than I am about, any type of U.S. invasion of Iran, fictional scenarios like that. And I don't know how much Russia can help Iran shore its intelligence and security situation and domestic political situation up. Those are actually Iran's weakest points, I would say. They'll try to help them with intelligence and satellites and air defense now, probably electronic warfare, and all of that will help Iran. But Iran, more than anything, needs to worry about co-option, infiltration, color, revolution, regime change type stuff. Because look what happened to Syria, right? The Syrian government was not overthrown in a pitched battle by 15,000 Al-Qaeda. It was overthrown in a massive co-option and intelligence operation, penetrating the Syrian military and its top officials and bureaucrats. That's what happened. And I'm sure there are people in Israel and the United States saying, well, if it worked that well in Syria, it'll probably work pretty well in Iran. So, and I do not have intimate on the ground, grounding of the Iranian political and domestic situation. Talk to Marandi for that, right? But my sense is that Pezeshkian is a lot dovish, weaker than a lot of the other political forces like the IRGC and some members of the clerical establishment want the Iranian president to be. And so there may be, political tensions within Iran as well. And certainly we know that there's already political tensions between Iran and the Axis of Resistance after what Israel did to the leadership of Hezbollah and Hamas, and has acted with impunity, bombing Yemen and Lebanon and everything else, to what I think most people, certainly within the Axis of Resistance, regard as a fairly late in the day and tepid response, trying not to escalate by Iran. And maybe Russia, is like, hold on, it will take time for us to, buff up your defenses, right? Just don't be provoked. Maybe Russia has been at some degree telling them that as well. It will take us a few years, right? This is signed. Now we can begin building. It's just not going to happen overnight. Don't get provoked into anything. Maybe that's part of the argument, or maybe that's simply Pezeshkian's way of looking at the world in a less quote unquote hardline way than say Raisi or those previous to him. But my ultimate belief, and I think it's been borne out in Ukraine, is if you show the US weakness or even restraint, it will interpret it as weakness and then seek to take advantage of that. You can only deal with the US in the way that they understand the world, which is from a position of strength and action. Not every country has the luxury of being able to respond in that way. Even Russia and China don't all the time, but at least they can in certain times and places. And right now, the outcome, of the conflict in Ukraine is still largely in Russia's court. They realize they're dealing with it from a position of strength, and they have no intention, as far as I can see, of surrendering that or in backing down on their goals and terms in any way. But I still hope that this strategic partnership has the time and the resources that it needs to come to the fruition that it could be. And keep in mind that China and Iran also have a strategic partnership. I'm not familiar on the exact terms of this, but once again, I saw the video being promoted on the internet today, decades ago, when then Senator Joe Biden was in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was laughing about Russian objections to the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. And Biden was laughing when they said we might have to turn to China. And he said, yeah, good luck with that. Good luck in your senior year. Something asinine and childish like that. And he specifically, you go to China, go to Iran. And look at, here we are, more than 2 decades down the line, and we definitely have a different and much more powerful axis, you want to call it a triumvirate of resistance to the U.S. hegemon, that is Russia and China and Iran. And Ultimately it all boils North Korea and those are still sideshows. Venezuela, they're Syria, ultimately less important, but the kernel of resistance and thus the kernel of a multipolar world is still Russia, China, and Iran. Brazil and India are still trying to believe that they can do this by peaceable means and stealth and not openly confronting or resisting the United States. And my apologies, to you there on that regard. But ultimately, the U.S. will always come down, and you're either with us or against it, as the shoe drops. And it's the U.S. sanctioning India and Indian companies and threats and everything. And what kind of partner is that? You believe that you can leave the heavy lifting on disagreement and conflict with the U.S. and the West to Russia and China and Iran? Well, I would say, good luck with that. I hope you're right, but I don't do hope. So the piper will come. There will be a price to pay for appeasement of the United States in good time. Ultimately, that is an invariability, I believe. It's practically a maxim of this terrible time of attempting to forge a multipolar world out of a unipolar world of hegemony. Gramsci is credited as having said, "The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And
exactly.
people, that's our generation. We live in that pivot point of history. We live in the time of monsters.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today.
If I could just add one little note onto
Go
the
ahead.
end, if you'll suddenly notice, the New York Times announced today that those tens of thousands of secret, stealth, invisible North Korean super soldier meat assault have suddenly vanished from the front lines in Ukraine and disappeared back to North Korea now that Trump has taken office, I guess. And, it's just absolutely amazing, because I guess there was less belief that the Trump administration would play along with this shared fiction about North Korean troops fighting in the SMO. I mean, they were there in the thousands. Ukrainians killed thousands of them. They just all burned their faces afterwards, so he couldn't identify the bodies. And this other, at the shamelessness that the Western mainstream media has treated this cockamamie bit of propaganda over the last few months has been just absolutely unbelievable. You think that they couldn't get any lower. I saw one sentence in the entire Western mainstream media over these last months that even questioned this. It was in an article by the BBC, right? And it wasn't even a sentence of their own. It was a sentence of a Ukrainian soldier in Kursk, supposedly where these North Korean troops were before now they've all vanished and been withdrawn after suffering thousands of casualties, right? He said, it can be very hard to find a North Korean soldier at night in the dark Kursk forest, especially when they're not there, right? No comment from the BBC. They didn't follow that up. They didn't care to analyze it or touch it in any way. They just put that on the end of one of their stories. And it was the most honest sentence in the last several months of the Western media about this whole North Korean soldier in fighting, Ukraine hoax that has emerged. But now, they're just wrapping up this whole story, this whole thing. And what else can you say? Shame on you, New York Times, and everyone else who has played. One day in a just world, you would be held to account on being the absolutely just obsequious and shameless propaganda outlets that you have been.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Yep.
Great
Cheers.
pleasure as always.
Thanks for having me.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye.